Hi, and welcome to the beginning of our intro biology class. So in this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about what biology is and also what science is and what makes it different than other ways of knowing about the world. So Carl Sagan, who was a physicist and cosmologist who died in the late 80s, he said science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. And we will talk about that, how scientists approach problems, what a hypothesis is, and what it means that science is data-driven rather than conclusion-driven. Our conclusions, we always have to be ready to change our conclusions in science when there's new data. So we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about some of the big theories in biology that we're going to be covering over the course of the semester, like cell theory, evolution, energy transfer, metabolism, like photosynthesis and respiration, especially how enzymes work, heredity, how DNA works, how genes become proteins during gene expression. So those are basically what we're going to cover during this semester. So we'll get a little taste of all those things in this chapter as well. Biology is the study of living things. So how do we define living things? And there are 7 characteristics, about 7, that are generally recognized as being characteristics of things that we think of as alive. And to start off with, all living things are organized starting with at least one cell. So there are living things that have only a single cell, like the euglena here on the right, and there are also living things that are multicellular, meaning that their basic body form contains many cells, like plants, animals, and most fungi. All living things use energy, and this is also known as their metabolism. What kind of metabolism do they have? And we roughly divide all living things into 2 big categories, autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs, so here's some Greek roots. Whenever we have a word that has Greek or Latin roots, I'm going to try to give you what the roots mean, because for me, that helps me to remember what they mean, or to figure it out later if you forget what they mean. So auto is self, troph is feed or eat. So an autotroph means self-feeding, and mostly the things that are autotrophs are photosynthetic, meaning that they can take energy from the sun and convert it into cellular energy. Heterotrophs get their energy from eating others, and all animals are heterotrophs. We're heterotrophs. Fungi are heterotrophs. Most bacteria are heterotrophs. So this is a broad distinction that we use, and it's going to be important, especially when we talk about energy conservation. All living things maintain homeostasis, and this means that they maintain stable internal conditions, such as pH, salt level, and sometimes temperature, although that's less common. Animals like humans, we're pretty unusual in that we maintain a constant internal temperature using metabolic activity. That's actually pretty unusual. Most organisms don't do that. All living things can reproduce, and this could be a single cell dividing or whole organisms reproducing. All living things grow and develop, and even single cells, after they divide, have to grow larger before they can divide again. Some single cells have kind of complex development. After they divide, they grow various protrusions. Multicellular organisms, though, have the most complex development, like animals and even plants start out as a single cell, which would be a fertilized egg in both plants and animals. And this goes through complex divisions and tissue rearrangements to end up with the adult organism that has many different kinds of cells that work together. All living things have a mechanism for heredity, and so they can evolve and adapt, because that mechanism, DNA replication, is not perfect. So generation after generation, changes occur just by random mutation. And we're going to talk a bit about that in several different places during this semester, both DNA mutations and how that contributes to evolution of species. So mutations are random, but evolution and adaptation to the environment is not random, but we'll talk about that. So far, all the things that we consider alive use DNA as their hereditary material. It's possible we could find something alive in the future that some cell that does not use DNA, that maybe uses RNA or something else. It hasn't happened yet, but we haven't studied all of the microscopic organisms on the planet yet. Probably only about half of the bacteria and small single-cell prokaryotes have been actually studied scientifically. So far, everything we consider alive uses DNA as its hereditary material. And lastly, living things respond to the environment. Even single cells, like bacteria, respond to the environment by changing their gene expression. So, for example, if you're growing bacteria in your standard L-broth bacterial culture, and you add a different sugar, you add lactose or something that's not normally found in that growth media, the bacteria will change their gene expression within minutes to start making enzymes to digest the new sugar source. So even single cells change their gene expression and respond to the environment. Of course, animals and plants have very complex mechanisms for responding to the environment, which we generally, some of them would be classified as behaviors, but they don't have to be that complex in order to be considered a response to the environment. Change in gene expression in response to something that happens or changes in the environment is considered responding to the environment. So given those 7 characteristics, do you think viruses are alive? Viruses are very small. They are generally, almost all viruses, we're going to talk about viruses at the end of the semester. Generally, viruses are much smaller than the smallest cells, although there are some big viruses that are bigger than bacteria. So what are they missing? Generally, scientists do not consider viruses to be alive, and that is because they're missing most of those traits. We've all learned a lot about viruses during the pandemic here, so you might have learned just by happenstance that viruses need a living cell in order to reproduce. They cannot reproduce by themselves. If you have viruses in a test tube and you give them nutrients and amino acids and ATP even, they don't do anything. They don't have any metabolism. They don't maintain homeostasis, but they do have heredity. Oh, they don't have cells either. They do have heredity though, and they can evolve and adapt because their genetic material, which could be DNA or RNA, as we've heard with the coronavirus, the genetic material is RNA, which mutates even faster than DNA viruses' genomes. Because they use the same basic nucleic acids as their hereditary material, mutations occur, and so they can also be selected for based on the environment. We're going to talk a lot more about viruses. So viruses are very important in biology, but they are not at this time considered living organisms. However, that could change. Things that we consider alive, we kind of divide roughly into 2 categories, again, based on whether they have a nucleus. So karyo is a Greek root that we now use to mean nucleus. So prokaryotes are things that don't have a nucleus. Pro means before. So prokaryotes are things that were around before the nucleus evolved. Eukaryotes, EU in Greek means true or good. So eukaryotes are organisms that have a true nucleus, which is a membrane-bound cellular structure. The chromosomes containing the DNA are inside the nucleus. In Greek, karyon means nut, and this is partially we use that word because the very first microscopists who were using pretty primitive microscopes and looking at cells noticed that some cells had these kind of oval structures inside of them, and that stained really darkly with whatever stains they were trying to use on the cells. And that was the nucleus. Of course, they had no idea what the function of the nucleus was, or they didn't know about DNA or even chromosomes yet, but that was the distinction. So besides eukaryotes having a nucleus, eukaryotes also have a lot of internal membranes, which in a later chapter we're going to talk about all of the internal cellular structures that are found in eukaryotes. They tend to be larger and more complex. But there is some overlap in the sizes. Prokaryotes tend to be small, and the bacteria that's pictured here, this is just an E. coli bacteria, the workhorse of the molecular biology lab. And they're about 2 micrometers in size, and we're going to learn in our first lab what that is, what a micrometer is, and we're going to become very familiar with all the metric units over the course of the semester here. So on the right is a eukaryotic cell membrane. Actually, it's a ciliated membrane. I think it's from a mammalian lung. I don't think it's from a human lung, but you can see the nice cilia up on the top of those cells and the nice nuclei inside of those cells. The difference in magnification here is very large. So that E. coli on the left, that's about 2 micrometers in length, and those cells on the right, they're very kind of elongated cells, and they're about 50 micrometers in length. So even though they kind of look the same size between these two pictures, or the bacteria actually looks even larger, that's a difference in magnification. Although the biggest prokaryotes are bigger than the smallest eukaryotes. So smaller isn't absolutely certain that it's a prokaryote. We have another category that we also use, and we'll talk about why this is, and that is domain. So prokaryotes are divided into 2 domains, archaea and bacteria. And everybody's heard of bacteria, but probably most of you haven't heard of archaea. Eukaryotes only have 1 domain, Eukaryota. And that reflects the fact that eukaryotes evolved more recently. Bacteria and archaea are older, and so they've had time to evolve more differences between them. The way that we organize things in biology is based on how alike things are. So the more alike things are, the further down in these categories they're going to be. So let me get my pointer here. All right, so here's domain up here at the top, and that's the biggest category that we have for living things. There are only 3 domains of all living things. Remember, viruses don't have 1. So if we were going to add viruses to living things, we'd have to add another domain because they don't fit into the other domains. Domains are divided into kingdoms, then phyla, then classes, orders, family, genus, and finally species, which probably you've all heard the term species. So if we look at 2 organisms that are closely related here, wolves and coyotes. So gray wolves, those are the wolves that live in Yellowstone National Park. Coyotes, these are our local coyotes. And we start out with domain. They're eukaryotes. We're also eukaryotes. They're in the animal kingdom. We are also in the animal kingdom. They are in the class Mammalia, or mammals. Mammals are animals that have fur and feed their babies milk, and this includes a huge variety of organisms, including seals, whales, bears, mice. They're all mammals. Wolves and coyotes are also in the carnivore order, which includes dogs and cats and seals and walruses and what else is in there? Bears, raccoons. They're all in the carnivore order. Pandas are in the carnivore order, even though they don't eat meat. So things that are in the same order, it reflects a common ancestor that they all had. Then down to family, the canids, or the dog-like things. So the canid family includes foxes and African wild dogs, and pretty much everything you can think of that's a dog-like carnivore is in this group. And then we have their genus, Canis. Now there's a genus may have only a single species, like ours, or a genus might have hundreds of species. It depends on how much diversity has evolved recently. So if things are in the same genus, it means they're very closely related. So wolves and coyotes are both in the same genus, Canis, so that's the first part of their scientific name there. Wolves are Canis lupus, and coyotes are Canis latrans. And so that tells us if you see two things in the same genus, they are closely related. Like if you see like the newly discovered extinct species of human, Homo naledi, it's in our genus, Homo, which means that it's going to be closely related to us. And they went extinct, we're not sure, probably 100,000 years ago. So that's a good way to tell how closely related things are, is if they're in the same genus, they're very closely related. If they're in the same family or order, we're going to expect them to have a lot of things in common, like cats and dogs. They're both carnivores, they have large canine teeth, they're both in the order carnivore. We would expect most organisms in there to have a lot of similarities. So I don't expect you to memorize this, but you're going to be dealing a lot more with this if you go on and take next semester's class, which is going to be a lot of animal phyla and plant phyla. But you can remember it by kind of saying it like a little song. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And you just say that to yourself if you want to memorize it. But I'm not going to test you on memorizing all those categories. So very often you will see me and other people represent living things on some kind of a tree. And these trees aren't artistic. They're supposed to... So you'll see in our book and many other sources, people putting living things on these trees. And they're not supposed to be artistic, they're supposed to represent what has happened during evolution. So they change over time. And trees that, wait, let me get my pointer back here. Trees that were constructed back in the 1980s are not so correct anymore. And we'll talk about that when we talk about protists, how our ideas of how different protists are related to each other has changed enormously with the newer DNA evidence that's available to us now. And we have a lab where we're going to talk about protists. So ideally, so in this particular category here, we have the past over here on the left and present over here on the right. And the branch length represents how related things are. So you can see there's quite a short branch length between fungi and animals, which indicates that we're fairly closely related to fungi. We're more closely related to them than we are to plants, for example. But between animals and bacteria, there is an enormous branch length. And that indicates that we are, out of all the living things that are alive today, we are most distantly related to bacteria. However, we do share a common ancestor with bacteria that lived about 3.5 billion years ago. And we will talk about that when we talk about the origin of life. Bacteria are, by some measures, the most successful organisms on the planet. They are ubiquitous, meaning they are everywhere. They are up in the high atmosphere. They are miles underground. They are at the bottom of the ocean. When they take cores out of the bottom of the ocean, they find bacteria living meters down in the sediment. Bacteria can survive in a huge variety of environments. They have the most diverse metabolic activities. They have several kinds of metabolisms that no other organisms have. So they've also been around the longest. As we'll talk about when we talk about the origin of life, the very first cells were most like bacteria. The other prokaryotic species, remember that means without a nucleus, are the Archaea. And they were named Archaea because the guy who first discovered that they were not bacteria and were in fact very distantly related to bacteria, Carl Woese at the University of Illinois, he thought that he had discovered the first cells, the original, like, oldest type of cells on Earth. And that's what the root arche means. It means first, like architect. If you're going to build a building, the first thing you need is somebody to design it. So that's why architect is named that. So the Archaea, we no longer think the Archaea are like the first cells, but the name sticks. So there are two basic types of Archaea: methanogens, which from their name, methanogen, they generate methane as part of their metabolic activity. These live in swamps and low oxygen environments, wet, low oxygen environments. And many of the rest are extremophiles. They live in environments where other organisms, even bacteria, can't survive, like very high temperatures, very acidic environments, or super high salt, like in the Dead Sea and the Great Salt Lake in Utah. This is a picture from Yellowstone National Park. This is an area where there are geysers and hot springs all over the place. And these rocks that you see here in the foreground that look kind of orange, they get splashed with boiling water several times a day. And the only organisms that can survive in that environment are one species of Archaea called Thermus aquaticus. That's what this orange stuff is all over the rocks. It's one of these Archaea. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Archaea later in the semester. For eukaryotes, the oldest eukaryotes are the protists, and the protists are pretty much everything that's not a plant, an animal, or a fungi. If it's not a plant, an animal, or a fungus, and it's got a nucleus, it's a protist. So it's kind of a catch-all category. Most things that we call protists now are single cells, although they're very diverse, and there's both autotrophs and heterotrophs. You can see here this green one here, this is a euglena, and they are an autotroph, and this is a paramecium, and they are a heterotroph, and they eat rotting plant material. We're going to hopefully look at both of these under the microscope alive during our protist lab, because they're kind of fun to look at. The protist kingdom is not, it's kind of a kingdom in quotation marks now, because it's been broken up using DNA evidence to try to figure out which protists are more closely related to other ones into 6 big groups and a dozen or so small groups. And it's still being worked out. It's turned into an extremely complex picture. We'll try to break it out a little bit during our lab that we have on protists. But it's a very complex picture. It's much more complex than just simply all these things are in one kingdom. Because really, the other big kingdoms, fungi, animals, and plants, evolved from different groups of protists. But we'll talk about that when we get to that lab. The other eukaryotic kingdom is fungi, or one of the other ones. And our most familiar fungi are probably mushrooms, but the fungi include not just that, but also all the yeast, which are single-celled fungi, furry molds. There's all sorts of different things. Things that used to be considered fungi 30 or 40 years ago, we now know are actually protists and don't properly belong in the fungal kingdom. So, you know, things are always changing as new evidence comes out. We now know that fungi are extremely ecologically important. And this is brand new information that started to be discovered in the late 80s and early 90s. There's a lot of research going on right now. It is now known that almost every species of tree has fungi growing on their roots that it is dependent on for proper nutrient absorption. So in this image here, we have two little pine seedlings starting to grow, and the root is kind of yellowish, and all this white fluffy stuff here that you can see, that's fungi that are growing in the soil, and they are actually connecting these two pine seedlings. And we now know that fungal connections are used by trees and some other plants to exchange nutrients, to help smaller plants that have a lot of shade to get glucose and nutrients that they can't get because they're not getting enough sunlight, so they can't make it for themselves. So it's a really interesting and complex picture. That is really a lot of research on this going on right now. We now know that most of our important crop plants depend on fungi in the soil in order to grow properly and get nutrient absorption, like soybeans, for example. If you try to grow soybeans in sterile soil that has no fungi in it, they will grow, but they won't get very big, and they just can't absorb nutrients properly. So very important area of research, especially given current farming practices, which tend to deplete the soil of everything, including nutrients that the fungi need. Plants are another multicellular kingdom. So the three multicellular kingdoms are animals, plants, and fungi. Fungi are almost all multicellular, although they're pretty simple for a multicellular organism. Plants are all multicellular, meaning if it's a single cell and it's green, it's not a plant. It's some kind of a protist. Plants evolved on land, and they're still mostly terrestrial today. Most of the things that are in the ocean that look like plants are mostly algae, which are mostly not true plants. It's very complicated. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the protist lab as well. They're almost all photosynthetic. There are a few plants that have lost their ability to photosynthesize and now are parasites on other plants. And lastly, our kingdom, the animals. Animals are all multicellular, and they're heterotrophic. There are more types of marine animals than terrestrial animals. Animals evolved in the sea about 600 million years ago, and only came on land after the plants about 400 million years ago or so. Animals have more specialized cell types than any other type of organism. Humans have over 200 different types of cells, and that's not an unusually high number. Many kinds of animals, including birds and reptiles, also have that many specialized cells. But animals include more simple organisms like sponges, jellyfish, which scientists would now like us to call jellies because they're not fish. They're all animals as well. In fact, jellyfish are closer to the very first animals to evolve than almost anything else. And insects are animals. It's when we say animal, just in everyday speech, usually we mean a mammal. If somebody said, "Hey, there's an animal in the front yard," you're not picturing a dragonfly or a bird. But in science, animal kingdom includes a huge variety of organisms, things that move, things that are multicellular, and heterotrophic, that's the animals. The way that we name organisms today started in the 1700s. There was not a lot of agreement on how to scientifically name species, and Carl Linnaeus noticed that scientists in different countries were calling the same species different things. And he said, we need to come up with a way that every scientist in the world is going to call the same species the same name. And his method is what we still use today. We use two words. The first one is the genus, which many species might have, and the second one is called the species epithet. and that's unique. So the two-word combination is unique for that species. A lot of times they're Latinized, especially the older species names are all Latinized. Although that's slowly changing because there's no particular rule that says they have to be Latinized. So there's a lot of new species being named, for example, by scientists in China who are giving them Chinese-based names. And, you know, that's totally fine. You might know what our scientific name is. And this is actually one of the only things that Carl Linnaeus, who was very kind of famous in his lifetime, this was one of the things that got people upset at him, was that he named our species and put us in the animal kingdom. People did not like that. But that is where we belong. So our species name is Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus. And we are the only remaining species in our genus. There are quite a few extinct species in our genus. I think that we're up to 12 or 13 now discovered extinct species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans and the newly discovered Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis, the hobbits who lived on Flores Island in Indonesia. And this S is not a plural, it's part of the Latinized name, so it's always has an S on it. It's not a plural. Wolves, Canis lupus, as we already mentioned. Sometimes there's a third word, like dogs are Canis lupus familiaris. And this is a subspecies, if you see a third word on there. So wolves and dogs are the same species, and they can easily interbreed. But dogs are different enough that we can identify them in the fossil record. If we have a skeleton of a dog and a skeleton of a wolf, you can tell them apart. That's why they're a subspecies. They're different enough that we can easily identify them. And we can tell that dogs have been evolving away from wolves for about 30,000 years, which is not really long enough for a totally new species to evolve. But that's a long time. That's a lot. But we don't see this very often. But domestic animals sometimes get this because, especially if their wild ancestor is still around, like it is for the wolves. For many of our domestic species, like cattle, the wild version has gone extinct. Some of the rules here for scientific name is the scientific name is always italicized. So you notice all these scientific names down here, they are italicized. And that is a way to tell that it might be the scientific name of a species. So if you're just reading something in a news article and you see two words and they're italicized, it's like, oh, is that the species name? That's a way for us to tell that. The genus is always capitalized. Species epithet is never capitalized, even in a title. So if you had Homo sapiens in the title of a paper, you would not capitalize the S. And that, again, these capitalization rules help us to figure out because you know, when you're reading a scientific paper especially, you run across new species names that you've never heard of all the time. And if we follow these rules, then that gives your reader a clue that, oh, this is a species name. Some of these are familiar. Escherichia coli, that's one I showed you a picture of earlier, the bacteria. Sometimes they just take the common name and Latinize it, like Rattus ranus. Apis mellifera is the honeybee. Apis just is bee in Latin. Mellifera is honey. Quercus alba, this is a native Illinois oak. Quercus is just oak in Latin, and alba is white, so the white oak. The red oak, another native species, is Quercus rubra. If we want to abbreviate it, the only correct way to abbreviate it is to shorten the genus to a single letter, put a period, and then the species epithet, still not capitalized, still italicize it. So I know a lot of you are going on to take microbiology. If you're going to do that, you can really impress your professor on your lab reports by putting the names of all the bacteria correctly by either writing the whole name out like this, and if you write it by hand, instead of italicizing, we underline, and abbreviate them like this. And if you do that, oh, your professor is going to be so happy, because that is the correct way to do it. So in this class, we're going to start at the lowest level in biology and talk a little bit about chemistry, because this is going to help make sure everybody's on the same page. Chemistry is not a prerequisite for this class, so I want to make sure that everybody knows the structure of molecules, because we're going to be talking about the structure of DNA and other large molecules and proteins and enzymes. So we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the basics of chemistry. So that's going to be our first chapter after this one. Then we're going to spend some time talking about cell structures, organelles and whole cells, all the parts of cells like the nucleus and ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum and the membranes. And then the next level up in complexity, cells, organs, and organ systems. We are not covering this. This would be covered by an anatomy and physiology course, which there is an anatomy and physiology for non-science majors, which I think is called human physiology or something like that. Or it's covered by, well, they will also cover this in the next semester of this class, 1152. Whole organisms, how they interact in populations, species, and communities. Again, this is ecology and environmental science, and this will be covered in next semester of this class. Ecosystems and the biosphere. Biosphere is kind of a new word. Biosphere means the shell where all the living things are, this hollow sphere on the outside of our planet where everything alive lives. Because, of course, the center of the Earth is hot, molten rock, and there's nothing alive in there. So the top couple of miles or so, it's just a few miles thick, that's where all the living things are, and that's why we call it the biosphere. So biological systems are really complex. And complex systems show something called emergent properties, which is why you need to study not just in a reductive way, breaking things down to the parts, but also whole systems have to be studied. So what is an emergent property? An emergent property is something that happens in a very complex system. It's something that you can't know just from studying the parts. So imagine if all you had to study about a species was its DNA sequence. And we could learn a lot from that. We could learn what other things it's related to, what kind of proteins it makes. We might even be able to tell like what kind of metabolic activity it has from that. But we would never be able to predict very much about large or complex things like behavior. Like, is this a species that lives in large groups? Is it a species that has flocking behavior? That would be really hard to tell from just the parts. We really need to study whole systems. So some examples of really complex systems would be things like human consciousness. Why do our brains allow us to be self-aware? That's consciousness. You're aware that you are a separate mind from other people's minds. Our brains have all the same parts as a monkey brain, as a dog brain, as a rat brain, but we don't consider any of them to have self-consciousness or self-awareness. So why? What has happened once your brain just gets big enough? It's something that's under study. The behavior of flocks of birds. We have a bunch of birds just following simple rules, and schools of fish as well. They move in these really complex patterns, but each individual bird is just following a simple set of rules. They don't have a leader who's telling everybody what to do. That's an emergent property of those species. Earthquakes are an emergent property of the Earth's crust, which is why they're very hard to predict. They're extremely complex systems where you have stress building up and things, even the temperature affects earthquakes. Hurricanes also hard to predict because it's a very complex system. The atmosphere interacting with the surface of the ocean is a really complex system. Our computer models keep getting better and better, but they can still be famously wrong. Like when Hurricane Sandy hit New York a few years ago, out of the 13 or so different computer models, only one of the computer models correctly predicted that this hurricane might hit the east coast of the United States. Even something that some of you might be more familiar with, like the stock market and the economy, it's so hard to predict which stocks are going to go up or down that anybody who makes a lot of money in the stock market immediately gets investigated by the SEC because they assume that you have insider information. And they probably do. It's like winning at blackjack and Las Vegas. If you're winning, you're doing something. You're cheating. They know you are, because it's too unpredictable. So in a system like a biological system that's super complex, the lesson is we also have to study the whole system. So it's not just about reducing everything to the smallest bits and understanding it. For example, once physics has their, unifying theory figured out, that won't mean an end to biology, because complex systems have emergent properties, and there is nothing we know of that's as complex as a living system. One cell is more complex than anything in chemistry or physics. So whole systems have to be studied. We have to study every level from an ecosystem down to biochemistry. Okay, so for what is a living thing, we talked about the 7 properties, and different authors variously divide these up. Some have only 6 because they group some of these together. Living things have at least one cell. They use energy. They have a metabolism. They maintain homeostasis. They grow and reproduce. They have heredity involving DNA, and they evolve, and they respond to the environment. Now, the ones that viruses are missing, viruses don't have cells. Viruses don't use energy. Viruses don't maintain internal homeostasis. They do not grow and reproduce. They need a cell to replicate their genomes and their proteins, and they don't respond to the environment. So the only one on this list that viruses have is heredity and the ability to evolve. We consider them parasitic chemicals, although very important in biology, but not considered living things. The 3 domains of life, so domain is the highest category, is Archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes, and we, of course, are eukaryotes. And this division represents a very ancient split in the evolution of life on our planet, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the origin of life. And the 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes: protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And the protists, again, we'll talk more about protists. This is kind of a catch-all category for everything that's not a fungi, a plant, or an animal. If it's a eukaryote and it's not one of these other 3, then it's a protist.